So this won't follow the usual format, so this is more a story of a very painful journey to an ultimately doomed zero cycle. So to set out some context, I was recording some easier runs a week ago, or about 2 weeks ago at this point, like final zero cycles for both sides, or Castorice versus Svarog. And in doing so, kind of got baited into attempting Castorice versus Aventurine, since at least at the time, it basically wasn't done yet at the no limited Eidolons level, where I first attempted it, which made it slightly more enticing. Well, this turns into a downward spiral for about a few days and hours of footage of failed runs, and plenty of painful lessons relating to specific mechanics. With this much sunk cost, there was no way I wasn't going to make a video about it. So here it is. I'll try to give a bit of a narrative flow of the story, from conception to the various hurdles, to ultimately why the run simply doesn't work. So let's first go with the team selection. We might often need to revisit this step multiple times. Now you could bring the usual Castorice, 3B, Hyacinth, and RMC core, but if that team does work, then you'll likely have seen someone do it already. So we need to go back to the drawing board. For team building, it's of course the easiest to lock in what is basically mandatory. So Cass herself and Hyacinth, since otherwise nobody is charging Cass. RMC herself is not technically mandatory, but you do need something extremely worthwhile to replace her if you choose to do so. Could my favorite duo of Silverwolf and Cypher work? Maybe. I took the team for a spin, and it immediately became clear that it was not likely to work. Looking at the duo as a standalone, with Cypher's LC on Silverwolf and Resolution on Cypher, you get these amazing debuff damage amp. 33% rest down, 97% defense threat, 40% vulnerability, and 24% true damage. This contributes to a whopping total of 409.6% total damage amp. However, in most teams, these multipliers will be rare. Not in this team though. Cass territory itself gives 20% rest down, her LC gives 30% defense threat, and Hyacinth herself gives 18% vulnerability via her LC. An immediate problem is that we overcap on defense threat. This forces Cypher to change to the Battle Pass LC, which has just 10% vulnerability. With the updated multiplier values, we go from 409.6% damage amp to just 323.8%. A massive drop. As a result, the final amp of my favorite Nativity duo is simply not enough. So I did take them for a run, but what's immediately obvious is that we won't be getting many dragons. Probably 3 in total on wave 2, with or without the dice game, simply due to worse charging by having one body less. So it's a tall order. 3 outs is fine if they do enough damage, and my dragons were automatically dealing between 850 to 900k in this context, so not nearly enough. Because we need 2 outs and 1 out plus 1 Cypher out split to balance the damage for both phases. But even 2 dragons for 1.8 million is not really enough, since the team kind of runs out of steam outside of the dragons, being unable to make up for the 560k. So that's out of the question. In the end, I finally landed on the team of Cypher plus RMC. RMC is obvious, has an extra turn, and by virtue of being Remembrance with an extra body, charges Cass that much faster. And is rather breakpoint centric, which I'll explain later. Cypher on the other hand, allows us to take advantage of the weaker wave 1s to save some of that damage for wave 2. Notably though, there is massive overlapping buff problem between Cypher and RMC, where their true damage amp becomes diluted, which is something that really only occurs between them outside of E1-3B. Once we're done with the team selection, the next step is to take it for a spin to get some idea of what it's capable of. First off, the builds. Cypher and Hyacinth are running their standard 200 plus speed builds, though it's a real question which one should be faster in this team. Castorice is doing Castorice team things with her standard DPS builds. And finally, RMC. What should RMC's build be? Well, it's still time to figure that out, and it will matter later. Here's what some early planning gameplay might look like. So Hyacinth's out plus skill gives us the first dragon of wave 2. And there's a cut here because I was checking things for about a minute. So now we're into charging the second dragon. RMC's skill here is important for just that little bit more charge. And thanks to Aventurine's damage plus Hyacinth, we get the second dragon. And we begin charging the third dragon. From here, you can see that almost 3 dragons are possible before Aventurine's dice game. So let's pause and take stock. If Aventurine selects Cas for the dice game, Cas can charge a dragon inside the game, summon it, and get refilled for another dragon. It also gives us a possible solution for the ending. Is it possible to charge one last dragon after the dice game dragon? So this gives us the rough outline of the battle. 2 dragons and whatever other chip damage we can land into 1 dragon during the dice game to finish off phase 1. And for phase 2, the actual dice game dragon into 1 last dragon into Cypher's out. It's around this point where we have to ask, how do we handle wave 1? And what possibilities exist to enter wave 2 with? Assemble wave 1 will look something like this. Now this is already quite far into my attempts, so some of the decisions may already look a bit odd. So for example, I didn't blow up the first dragon for more consistency due to fewer bounce hits, instead opting for the enhanced skill. There's ultimately more than enough damage for wave 1. So some of the more nuanced details I'll skip over, eventually covering on a final failed run. So the bounce hit on this dragon will eventually matter a lot. And this Blaze wannabe elite gives a lot of energy, with each bounce giving 10 energy, especially for the Remembrance girls. Further, if we don't break that elite, we can get it to use its bounce attack again for more energy and more new guard charge. So if it absorbs 1 to 2 corrosion, they'll use his bounce attack again, which is exactly what we want. And the main takeaway is that we basically need about 2 full dragon explosions to finish the wave. We can take advantage of the left elite to get a lot of energy, possibly even recovering Hyacinth's out in just 2 turns. And MOC is soon, not sure how long more we can delay it. At this point, you can think of various ways to achieve an appropriate wave 1 finisher. Usually, you want something big to make it reliable. A possible solution is switching a third dragon to finish wave 1. The smaller the damage source of the wave ender is, the more likely it is to fail as a result of general run variance. Things like which elite the blessing lands on, and for Castorice, the bounces on her dragon explosion. Now we can formulate a kind of proper structured run on wave 2. Some micro adjustments can still be made, but the overall plan is straightforward. And it's time for damage test. So I'm showing the end of wave 1 as well, because you can see that I was very close to finishing the elite off for quite a few attacks. And finally had to use Mam's turn to finish with Cas. And let's skip to just before the dice phase, since it's basically the same as what you saw before. So this is still relatively early on, so here I was thinking whether I should proc Mam's turn now or later. I decided to proc it now. And Cas does get selected for the dice game, which ends in failure. So there are 2 notable problems here. Well, besides losing the dice game of course. It's not actually charging casters out. So this can obviously eventually be remedied, but it does pose a real question of, am I certain the dragon charge break points I'm thinking of are reliable? Secondly, there's not enough damage. If you total up the dragon damage plus even an extra Castorice skill, assuming we ended the previous wave without the man pool, it would still only be about 29%. And when they show 30%, it means 30+% HP remaining. So that's definitely insufficient damage. So now what? Well, you can 1. Give up, or 2. Try to eke out a little bit more damage via relic improvements or other slightly cursed methods. But it's generally really only a point in this if you're already confident that there's enough damage, and that this is the only damage bottleneck left. Otherwise, who's to say that wasting resources trying to hit this damage bottleneck would still result in failure somewhere else? And now we address the elephant in the room. Everything I've showed you so far is like less than 75% of the run. Wave 1, and not even the end of Wave 2 Phase 1. How are we sure the remaining works? Well, you can do some experimental runs and also some math. There are 2 main questions we need answered. Is there enough charge to get the hypothetical last dragon? And is there even enough damage? So this is actually a mis-executed attempt, but regardless, this attempt gave me the answers I wanted. Fast forward to the dice game, and you'll know that she didn't enter with enough charge for the dragon in the dice game. So regardless, this enhanced skill rotation had plenty of damage, actually gave me some rotational ideas. So finishing phase 1, can we charge another dragon with just the remaining Hyacinth and RMC turns? So the answer turns out to be yes. Well, just barely. Advanced attack gives about 26%, Hyacinth's skill plus out gives about 67%, and this assumes health is still active, health is much lower. And finally, RMC's skill gives the last bit. How about damage? Well, I again executed this wrongly, but it doesn't really matter because we account for it separately. Basically, totaling all the damage we see and accounting for one more dragon. So 872 coins from before phase 2, Blessing burn damage, Hyacinth and Cypher's damage contribution, multiplied by Cypher's damage amp, and 2 dragons. Except the first dragon won't have Hyacinth's LC applied. The dragon earlier did 602k damage, but with the account for Ika not applying a vulnerability at the start of phase 2. So you have to adjust it by a factor of 1.4 over 1.58. And finally, account for Cypher's amp, but diluted by RMC. And even then, it's actually still enough. So before we go on, I have to admit that I wasn't familiar with running RMC together with Cypher. As a result, I vastly overestimated the would-be impact of Cypher's recorded damage before I attempted the run, wrongly assessing how easy it would be. By this point, I already learned to account for it properly. Well, now there was a pretty big mistake that I've got to account for in what I mentioned earlier, that will come back to bite me, but because it never had a chance to occur in any of my experimental runs, I overlooked it, so you might already have guessed what it is. Anyway, there's one main takeaway from the previous part, namely that I do need the third turn on RMC on wave 2. So eager at a 183.4 plus speed build, which I can only achieve with either Memory's Curtain Never Falls or Agaya's signature LC. Now the final hurdle, or at least in my mind, what was the final hurdle, which is to overcome the phase 1 damage issue. So at this point, I'll go over an optimization that I attempted that ultimately didn't work. So I actually learned it from the previous clip, and here's an example scenario where it might have been useful. So this is an earlier failed run where I was reminded that Mem's buff does wear off too quickly. As you can see, the advanced turn was the third turn, so Mem's buff has worn off, and we do no damage. However, if I could get RMCs out after the dice game ends, and before the dragon's turn, maybe I could advance Castorice ahead of the dragon. This even further helps us finish phase 1, as her enhanced skill is much stronger, while refreshing Mem's buff for the dragon to avoid what happened earlier. There's just a small problem. It doesn't work. For some reason, you're disabled until the next action, and you specifically can't insert any actions, so here was me trying it with 1x speed. And if you think it's skill issue, so often autoplay is able to cheat these types of things, except even autoplay fails here. Finally, there is technically one way. It's just not the solution you think it is. If you fail the dice roll, advanced attack counts as an action, so the disable is removed early for you to add your outs in. Of course, it's not ideal since, well, we need to win the dice roll. I can't really tell you about all the exhaustive list of things I've tried, because I tried a lot and invested a lot of resources and time into this run. Things like trying to move RMC's mempool placement around, and ultimately, with misplaced confidence, I thought if I just overcome this damage bottleneck, I'll have the run. So I invested a lot of resources into it. I basically used up all my resin, 3 times 5 of them, to improve Cass's relics. I was so desperate, I even moved RMC to Aglaya's LC because it adds about 1 substat worth of crit damage via conversion, compared to Memory's Curtain, which can't really buff the dragon. Finally, I also swapped some of Cypher's relics to more offensive stats, because as you'll see, it will matter. And finally, a fully explained failed run. It's fair warning, it ends rather abruptly, and I'll explain the rest. So the dragon breathes twice before using the claw, with prime toughness values and some damage. So the blessing landed on the champion. As a result, we use Castorice's enhanced skill before Hyacinth's out to reduce the damage by a little. And we choose this over blowing out the first dragon to reduce the bounce variance in the run. So the dragon finally blows up, and there's only 2 bounce configurations that are viable, 4-2 or 3-3, and it's 4-2 in this case. So RMC has to prime her energy a little, so she only outs after her next turn, and also needs to proc it for her own eagle advance. There's some micro damage adjustments I need to do by eyeballing the champion's HP here, so in this case, we target everything but Cypher's BA onto the champion, and Hyacinth needed to BA here as we need to save 1 SP for wave 2. So Castorice's skill here puts the Warlord at the ideal HP, and the left elite cannot be broken. We need Hyacinth to hit for 40 energy total this wave. So Castorice uses the dragon for the damage taken and blows it up, which should leave the Warlord at extremely low HP. So RMC skills here to prime Mem charge, and Hyacinth needs to skill here for new buff and to finish the elite. So believe it or not, every single Cypher damage matters, and they all need to crit. So Hyacinth needs to wait till her turn to out to ensure the third turn still has the out effect. And even if Mem was already 100% here, Cypher wouldn't advance Mem as the energy is full, so this Mem advance is reliable. We advance Castorice before using her out to ensure the 3% charge from outing is tallied. Now we quickly build up another dragon. And thanks to Aventurine, by Hyacinth's next skill, we have another to use. RMC skills yet again for charge and energy. RMC finding outs here to proc Mem to advance Cass. And it doesn't target Cass. But the run was impossible anyway. So the main question is, was there enough damage even if Cass was selected for the dice game? The answer is no for this run. But if Cypher critted everything, actually yes, she would have done enough damage on her next turn. Aventurine would have 8180 HP left after the next dragon, and we lost 4910 damage from Miss Crits. And the next BA doing about 4k is enough to finish phase 1. But as mentioned, there's a reason why I said this run is impossible, even if Cass was selected for the dice game, and we finished phase 1. The problem is a fatal mistake that I overlooked in my earlier damage estimation. The dice game dragon isn't just penalized by not having Hyacinth's LC applied, it also doesn't have Cypher's LC applied. And because I never actually managed to overcome this phase 1 bottleneck, I never actually encountered the scenario for myself. Acknowledging Hyacinth's LC not applying was something that I had to anticipate, but Cypher's LC slipped my mind when planning for it. Once you account for it, the initial calculations will leave Aventurine at 3% HP left. And even with updated damage values for my improved relics and setup, I'm still about 52k damage short, or about 2.2%. In fact, with the updated damage values, I can directly calculate the amount of substats I need to make this happen, and it's 18.9% crit damage. Now, my cast might be decently built, but unfortunately, it's still not quite good enough, so there will be a few people who will have the damage requirements to complete this specific run. And I don't think trying to get those extra substats is something that can happen in a reasonable amount of time and resources for me, which is why I eventually chose to give up. So since I had so much footage, I figured I should probably make a video about it. And perhaps it should give you some insights into the thought processes and difficulties faced with planning and executing a zero cycle, as well as a few glimpses into how failure looks like for these types of runs. Turns out, you can never really be too meticulous with planning these. I initially thought I had everything planned from energy and RNG hit requirements on both wave 1 and wave 2, many of which I didn't even mention. Even calculated out explicit new bug charging to the exact values to figure out how much HP I could drop from both RMC and Cypher to ensure the rotation still worked. But this one, admittedly very amateur slip up of forgetting to account for Cypher's LC when predicting damage, ultimately results in wasted resources and a failed run. So it's a pretty painful lesson for me. I hope amongst those that watch this to the end, you learned something, or at least enjoyed the story.